This is the second portion of Radolec's comprehensive tutorial for the Radon Report Manager, and this time we'll be focusing on inventory management. In this section, you'll learn how to add voltage readers, electrets, and other miscellaneous detectors. We'll be working with the same database that we created in our last tutorial, which doesn't yet have an inventory. So let's remedy that. From the main menu, click on the Inventory button. After the window opens, you'll see 4 tabs near the top. The one that we're currently in, the Reader and Reference Electrets tab, is exactly where we want to be, at least for now. Let's start off by adding a new reader. We can do this by clicking on the New Reader button, which will unlock the various reader fields below. Now we can type in our reader's serial number, the calibration date, our 2 reference electret serial numbers and their voltages, as well as their certification dates. Let's also set this reader as our default, which will allow it to be automatically selected whenever we're doing any radon test measurements with either short-term or long-term electrets. Selecting a default reader will also cause it to automatically appear in this window whenever it's opened, in addition to the most current calibration period, but we'll get to that a bit later. There's also one other checkbox here, called Inactive, which can be selected to remove this reader from active duty. An inactive reader cannot be selected when making a radon test record, but it's still going to appear in the reader drop-down box in this tab. After we've entered in our reader and reference electret information, let's take a few weekly readings. The date read field defaults to the current date, but this can be changed if you want. Proper protocol says that you should take reference electret readings on a weekly basis in order to ensure that your voltage reader is still operating properly. If both of your reference electret readings are way off their certified voltages, there's a good chance that something has happened to your reader to throw off its calibration. Note that, by default, the Radon Report Manager will remind you when your weekly reference readings are due, but you can disable this option from within the setup window, which we talked about in the previous tutorial. Okay, so far we've only dealt with a single calibration period. Throughout the years, however, you're likely going to be dealing with multiple calibrations, which Radolec recommends having done on an annual basis. So, let's pretend that a year has passed and it's time for our reader to be recalibrated. We do this by clicking on the New Calibration button to the right of the Calibration Period drop-down box. This will allow us to enter in the new calibration date, certified voltages, and certification date, which I'll do quickly. Now all of our old weekly reference electret readings will be saved with the old calibration period, and we'll be able to start from scratch with our new weekly readings, which are going to be attached to this new calibration period. Hopefully, this will prevent you from having to plod through potentially hundreds of weekly readings after a few years. If you want to pull up your old calibration period to review past data, you can simply select it from the calibration period drop-down box, as shown here. Now, the same can be done with the reader itself, but we've only added a single reader to our database, so it's the only one that'll show up in the reader drop-down box. Before we move on, there's one last button that we haven't talked about yet, the Edit Displayed Calibration button. The only time this button should be used is when you absolutely need to change one of the reader's fields that are normally locked in a given calibration period, such as one of the reference electret serial numbers or certified voltages or calibration dates. Basically, this is a button to allow you to correct a typographical error, such as if you incorrectly keyed in one of the fields. In other words, it should not be used to edit the fields after your reader has been recalibrated. That's what the new calibration button is for. And that wraps up this tab. Now it's time to start adding some detectors to our inventory. So let's move over to the Electron Inventory tab. This is where we can add both short-term and long-term electrets to our database. There's not much to this, so I'll begin by adding a few in. We type in the serial number of the electret, select either ST for short-term or LT for long-term from the electret type drop-down box. Double-check our inventory date, which simply represents when a specific electret was entered into the database, and then key in our initial inventory voltage. The last two fields, last voltage and last date read, will be automatically calculated for us. The last voltage field will let you know the voltage of the electret at its most recent record, which should also correspond with the last date read. Because these are new electrets, the last voltage and last date read fields will match our inventory date and initial inventory voltages. That's just because we haven't used them yet. After we use the electret for an actual deployment, these fields will change. So, this Electron Inventory tab is not only used to add new electrets to your inventory, but it's also able to give you a broad overview of your electret's current voltages, according to when they were last used in the database. Now, when we move over to the CRM Inventory tab, hopefully some of these fields will look a bit familiar. If we decide to add a continuous radon monitor to our inventory, this is where we'll enter in its serial number, manufacturer, model, calibration date, and inventory date. Just like in the Electron Inventory tab, we'll be able to see the date when this specific CRM was last used. In this case, because we just added it to our database a few moments ago, the last date used field will default to our inventory date. Moving onward one last time, we'll arrive at the Miscellaneous Inventory tab. If you want to add a device that isn't an electret or a continuous radon monitor, this is where you do it. This process is virtually identical to the electret and CRM inventory tabs. We type in the serial number, select the device type, AC for activated charcoal canisters, AT for alpha track, and LS for liquid scintillation. Then we type in our manufacturer and double check our inventory date. Even though the Radon Report Manager was initially built around Radelec's EPERM system, we've expanded it to accommodate a wide range of detectors. This software can create the same customer letters, deployment sheets, and lab reports regardless of which detector you're using. And before we conclude this section of the tutorial, there's one final feature that we've yet to discuss: deleting old and unwanted detectors from your inventory. This can be accomplished by left-clicking on the record selector, which is the leftmost column of any given record, and tapping the delete key on your keyboard. A message will appear asking you if you really want to delete the device, and select yes if you want to remove this device from your inventory. Note that this will not affect any of your old records, and they'll still show that you used this specific device for that test, but it's no longer going to appear in your inventory. And that pretty much wraps up the inventory window. In this section of the tutorial, we've discussed how to add a new reader to your database, manage its calibration periods, and take your weekly reference electret readings. We've also gone over the inventory management system, how to add electrets, CRMs, and miscellaneous devices to your database, and how to remove them as well. Maintaining an organized inventory is important, and we've tried to make this process easy for you. If you think there are some extra features which we're missing, or ways in which we could make this entire process more intuitive, give us a call at Radelec and tell us your ideas. Let us know what you're thinking. In the next section of the tutorial, we'll be heading into the customer data window, where we'll learn how to manage various customers and companies.